This is another video on China. This is on the Chinese Revolution. I was originally going to make it from Chinese Revolution from 1911 to 1949 when the communists came to power. It was just a huge information and I couldn't do it, so I'm making it two videos. This video will be on the tragedy of the Chinese Revolution. Early 20th century was basically a huge social and working class peasant and working class revolution all over China, and it failed. It was crushed through the horrific policies of the Comintern, the Communist International. Eventually, the communists did come to power, more as a peasant movement later in the 1940s. I will talk about that in my next video. This video is on the tragedy of the Chinese Revolution. It was on some my own impressionistic viewpoints of China. I lived there for 3 years and a little bit about what it's like there. Next, I did sort of a dynastic cycle, history of the Chinese dynasties, kind of superficial. I'm going to do this video and hopefully next video next week on the Chinese Revolution. Then I'm going to take a break a little while on China. I'll get back to it hopefully in June. And I'll talk about Mao and after, and then current topics, views of the left, debates within the left on China. I'll talk about the Uyghur situation, what's been happening in Hong Kong, my own opinions, my own takes on it. That'll be the controversial part of this video series. I think are controversial on the left. Okay, this video is on the tragedy of the Chinese Revolution. Okay, so last time I talked about Chinese dynasties, the Ming and the Qing. There was a dramatic population increase starting around the Ming and going into the Qing. Dramatic population of China dramatically increased. It was more or less steady state, around 50 million since the Han, roughly about almost 1,500, over 1,000 years. It stayed steady state. Then we don't exactly know why, but it shot up. And by the late Ming, sorry, by the late Qing, it was somewhere around 450 million. We don't really know why. There are debates among historians. Chinese historians are debating this. Generally held ideas that part of what they call the Columbian Exchange, crops from the New World, sweet potatoes, corn, new ways of cultivating rice. Not everyone agrees with this theory, but that's widely held theory. But we don't know what happened, but the population dramatically increased. And this put terrific strain on the traditional system of China from over 1,000 years old. Basically, peasants were squeezed into smaller allotments of land. By the early 1900s, something like over 60% of all peasants had no land. There was a terrific land hunger, and this fueled a lot of peasant unrest. They were also related to this were huge famines in the late Qing period. There was the Great Northern Famine, which I believe was from 1876 to 1878, result of drought and crop failures in some northern provinces of China. They're estimated that between 9 and 11 million people died in this. A little bit later, I believe 1906, there was a southern famine. So some southern provinces of China, believe around 25 million people were killed. It was horrific. Um, I mentioned foreign incursion in China. There were the Opium Wars, which basically China was forced to give basically treaty port rights to foreign powers, the British and the French. Shanghai was basically a European colony, pretty much run by the French. Hong Kong, British took Hong Kong, British colony, and British controlled cities up and down the Yangtze River. Um, it was a horrible humiliation for China. Opium rapidly spread through all layers of Chinese society, and it was a terrific drain of wealth out of China. I don't have the statistics, but it was a huge impact on draining wealth from China. China, like India, was before European contact, was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Became quickly one of the poorest countries in the world. Uh, there's the Taiping Rebellion, a vast rural uprising, and something like between 40 and 70 million people were killed. And possibly likely the Taiping Rebellion led or contributed to the later famines, like grain storage was destroyed or depleted, or resources could be used to alleviate famines were destroyed in this conflict. So Mike Davis talked about some of this in late Victorian Holocausts, like what would call developing nations, non-Western parts of the world had experienced a series of floods and disasters. The disasters, famines, natural disasters, like late 19th or late 20th centuries. Okay, so China's social structure was under strain during the late Qing. What they call a comprador elite along the coastal cities, especially Shanghai, and the China originally had a system like a bureaucratic Confucian bureaucratic a magistrate system where someone from the elite could work their way up, take these Confucian exams, and they'd be given like a post, some regional post as a magistrate, administrator, lawgiver, judge, whatever, in a small town. They could work their way up. It's a magistrate system, and there's some paternalistic system basically. This was under severe strain, basically collapsed in the late Qing, where the slave became commercialized. There's a terrific the comprador business class in Shanghai that arose based on banking, textile industry, but also banking, was sort of a parasitic elite, and they invested in land, but not in capitalist or industrial development of China. So the rural gentry became increasingly drawn into this nexus, this exploitive, parasitic nexus based in Shanghai, and this kind of basically changed the entire system of China. This horrific exploitive landlordism, things like that. And it said China was really devastated by foreign imperialists. Uh, they basically are the military and their science. They were no match for Western science and Western militaries, things like that. Earlier, somewhere in the 1850s, 1860s, Japan had it's called the Meiji Restoration. Basically, it was a coup by a samurai elite, the feudal elite in Japan. They carry out a bourgeois revolution, essentially by the feudal elite. Ironically in some ways, but they brought in Western science, technology, industrialized Japan. It was warped. It was a warped development, had sort of a hybrid capitalist feudal system evolved with a very strong authoritarian tendency, Japanese, that gave rise to Japanese militarism, Japanese imperialism, and we saw what happened. Similar thing on a different scale happened in Germany. The liberal revolution of the liberals in 1848 failed. They were afraid of the working class, basically. They failed, and Germany was united again, basically under the Prussian Junker aristocracy under Bismarck, and Germany rapidly industrialized and expanded, but they again had this deeply authoritarian strand in their system. Not saying that like France or U.S. or Britain are free from blame either. Of course, I'm not saying that, but okay, so anyway, that's the system. There was now Shi. I'm not pronouncing her name correctly, but she's known as the Dowager Empress. She was a huge power in late Qing dynasty China. She refused any change. Sometimes she ruled outright. Most of the time, she was a regent. But she was power behind the throne. She refused any change whatsoever. There's obvious China desperately needed to change. There was the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, and China lost big time. China had been under the onslaught of Western powers earlier. Now Japan came in. It was a devastating loss for China. Basically Korea was kind of sort of a Chinese protectorate, moved to becoming a Japanese protectorate, or uh, there was a Sino-Russian War in 1905, a little bit later, but it was a bad defeat for China. So this created a lot of soul searching, like even Japan, small Japan, who had been the student of China historically in this view. Even Japan is defeating China. So we definitely need to catch up. So in 1898, there was something called the 100 Days Reform. It was actually 103 days. Very complicated, but a young boy became emperor. I believe he was the son of the Dowager Empress. But he had a group. He was a young boy, but he had a group of like conservative reformers around him. They wanted to a couple of things. They wanted a constitutional monarchy, which was pretty dramatic. They wanted a Western civil service. They wanted a Western scientist, was borrow Western technology, science, send people overseas to study things like that. And one of the leading figures was a guy named Kang Yu Wei, who had his own version of Neo Confucianism. I mentioned him a bit last time. He wanted to go back to what he thought was the original idea of Confucianism, which he thought would have been more pro science. Later generations just dropped Confucianism, turned against Confucianism altogether, but he had a last ditch effort to revive the ancient tradition, update it. Well, anyway, this 100 Days Reform failed. Jushi organized a coup and overthrew this group. She assumed absolute power. After that, the reformers had scattered. Kang Yue went to Japan. He had a group around him. He Some of the other reformers were killed, horribly tortured, and the 100 Days Reform was ended. A little bit later, finally, I believe early 1900s, she finally instituted some reforms called the New Policy. It was meant to be done very rapidly and modernize, modernized military, especially. But it failed. Qing by this time had no credibility. Was utterly corrupt, absolutely no credibility by this time. So that's the background. That's the whole background. Now, the Chinese Revolution usually regards having begun in 1911, led by a guy named Sun Yat-sen. In Chinese, he's known as Sun Jia-sen. I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, but that's close. He was Cantonese or from a village outside what's now Guangzhou or Canton, now a huge metropolitan area. It was a village. As I understand, he was from the Hakka nationality. Came from sort of a hard scrabble peasant background, but he had an older brother, Sun Mei, who immigrated to Hawaii back when Hawaii was still a kingdom, although it was westernized. And he did, I don't know what he did there, but he was very, very successful. At one point, he owned a ranch with 16,000 acres. I actually don't know what he did there. But Sun Yat sen came as a young boy, came to Hawaii, went to high school in Hawaii, basically. He went to high school in Hawaii. He did very, very well. One point, he got an award from the King of Hawaii for academic excellence. He was at the top of his class. His brother, Sun Mei, though, became increasingly worried that his younger brother, Sun Yat-sen, was becoming converted to Christianity, and he really opposed this. He sent him back to China. At one point, at one point in China, he and a friend, after he returned to China, destroyed a statue of the emperor, an emperor in Chinese folk religion. The local villagers had worshipped and thought had healing powers. I don't know, he destroyed this. He got the villagers very angry at him. I don't know what was behind this, like revulsion at superstition, interest in science, modern science, or Christianity, or a mixture of things. But anyway, Sun Yat-sen finally finished up at a Christian high school. I believe it was a Jesuit high school in Guangzhou, and then he went to medical college in Hong Kong. Now, there were a huge number of missionaries, Western missionaries, especially American missionaries in China at this time. There are a variety of them. Many mixed. Many of them did bring in Western science and technology. Ironically, as this sounds, I'm not a big fan of missionaries, American evangelical missionaries at all myself. But back in that day, there's a wing of the American Protestant missionary movement, some themselves as the progressives, part of the progressive movement, and they had an influence in China. They didn't convert a lot of people to Christianity ultimately, but they did have a huge influence in helping open up China, bring Western ideas, science and technology and things like that. As strange as this might sound, but they did, and at times they're also cultivating more of a westernized elite in China. Okay, so Sun Yat-sen he became a doctor, went to medical college in Hong Kong, And he came in, he fell in with a group of radicals, like young radicals, group called the Four, jokingly called the Four Bandits, nickname. Uh, Now, Chinese people's stereotype of China is that they're very passive. Chinese people have said this to me. We're very passive people. We put up with a lot of abuse, with a lot of crap for hundreds of years, and we're very passive people. And in the 19th century, that was like the Western stereotype of China as well. But having said this, there was a huge ferment, especially in southern China, a huge ferment, like what over what direction China should go in. There were a lot of discontent, seething discontent. People thought we desperately needed change. A lot of debate which direction we should go in. And Sun Yat-sen fell in with the group of radicals, anti Qing radicals. This also fed into I talked last time about the Ming revivalist secret societies. The Ming Dynasty was popular, then the Qing wasn't, and there were zillions of small secret societies, underground groups, which are kind of Ming revivalists. This partly fed into the sentiment as well. Well, Sun Yat-sen organized a group called the Revive China Society, and he went back to one point. He went back to Hawaii. He fused this movement with a group called Fu Ren Society, which I believe that means "serve the people." Later became a Maoist slogan. But he went back to Hawaii, fused this group, and he organized a group called the Tong Ming Wei, which is like the United Effort, the United Way, basically. And this became the kind of his revolutionary organization. Had its ups and downs, dissipated for a time, but then had a big revival. Okay, so, Sun Yat sen, Western historians usually regard him as an absurd figure, but he's revered in China, both in mainland, the People's Republic of China, and in Taiwan, and among overseas Chinese too. He's very much of a revered figure. Sun Yat sen developed a political philosophy, basically three principles of the people. In a nutshell, the first one was nationalism or Minkin national rights. It was kind of democracy on a nationalistic basis, like Chinese democracy for the people of China, essentially. The next one was a democratic government. And the third principle was something like welfare, social welfare, which kind of gave a nod to socialism in some ways. So there are different ways of interpreting it. And I'm not going to go too much into the three principles. As far as I know, Sun Yat-sen didn't write a lot on this. He expresses in his various speeches and evolved a little bit over time. Um, he also later had a theory that like people are not ready for democracy right away. They'll need a long period of tutelage or long period of training before they can have a full democracy. Okay, so Sun Yat-sen went to Hawaii, fused several groups together, formed the Tongmeng Way, and then he spent a while traveling around the world fundraising for this organization for Chinese rebel movements. There were something like 7 attempts at an uprising, which all failed. Bang bang, all failed. Mostly in southern China, attempts to trigger some rebellion against the Qing, they all failed. One point, he was in Britain and he was kidnapped by the Qing. They took him using a Qing boat in the English Channel. They were undoubtedly going to bring him back to China, but have him killed. And I don't know this for sure. I suspect the British kind of were sort of aware of this, but didn't really say anything. But several social reformists of the day made announced this, built a big campaign, and the British government, finally intervened and freed him. Otherwise, he would have been killed. Anyway, he came back. He went to the U.S. after that. Oddly interesting. Chinese, it was a little problematical for him. Chinese people at the time were not allowed to enter the United States. There was what they call the Chinese Exclusion Act of, I think it was 1898. Chinese people simply were not allowed to come to the U.S. Chinese people were burned with the railroads. somewhat earlier, 1860s and onward. There were Chinatowns throughout the U.S., mostly in the West Coast, San Francisco. There was some horrific, Wyoming, so there's horrific racism against Chinese people. There was a pogrom in Wyoming, a group of them, several dozen were massacred. It was horrific. But they had this Chinese Exclusion Act. So the thing is, Sun Yat-sen was technically a U.S. citizen. That is, he had a document said he was born in Hawaii. He probably wasn't, but he was officially, and Hawaii by that time was a U.S. territory. So he could kind of get in under the wire as a U.S. citizen. He was an American. And technically, U.S. authorities, I think that was before the FBI, but there were police spying on him and watching him and saying, he's technically a U.S. citizen, but he doesn't really seem like he really identifies as an American. Anyway, I believe he was in Colorado fundraising, and when he got news that the eighth attempt at an uprising in Wuchang, a city called Wuchang, had succeeded. Now, Wuchang is part of Wuhan. The Wuhan's been in the news recently. Coronavirus originated there. It's like a conglomeration of three different cities. Wuchang is one of them. So anyway, the Wuchang uprising finally succeeded. Sun Yat-sen came back to China to join it. Now, the reason why the Wuchang uprising succeeded and triggering a revolution, really anti-Qing revolt, and the others didn't, was because the Qing nationalized the railroads. Now, China did have some railroad extension, railroad building. I believe it started around the 1850s, and some places it was locally uh, Sichuan province itself had spent a lot of money on building railroads. They were a bit more progressive than other areas of China. Elsewhere in China, they were financed by Europeans, especially by British and Germans and French. So nationalizing the railroads might sound like a good thing, but basically what it really meant is the Qing government was turning it over to Europeans, European finance capital, really. It's kind of today roughly equivalent to a country turning over major industry to the IMF. Like, not exact comparison, but the water wars in Bolivia, early 2000, they basically turned the water supply over to the IMF. Somewhat different context, but so anyway, the Qing nationalized the railroads, and they offered compensation by way of government bonds, which were worth nothing by that time, instead of currencies of a silver currency, which they used. So this was an uproar, this outrage, and literally triggered a revolution. Uh, I didn't mention this, but during the Dowager Empress's last years, early 1900s, there actually was an attempt to organize a Western military, something called the New Army. The Qing had their own bannermen, like very ancient tribal regiments everyone was grouped into, but there was an attempt to develop a modern army, and as there was a new army, and new army units around Wuchang rebelled. They joined this rebellion. Basically, it started the Qing had discovered a weapons depot or some warehouse where the rebel group was storing some weapons, and then they had a counter. The rebels had a counterattack against this, and the new army joined in against the Qing, and the Sichuan province also had their own uprising against this, ultimately crushed, but this triggered the 1911 revolution. In China, it's called the Xinhai Revolution, more based on the Chinese calendar. Essentially, I complicated what it means, but it's basically Chinese culture is big on anniversaries. So it wasn't the Xinhai Revolution. 1911 revolution wasn't a pushover. It took about a year. It came roughly from south to north, conquered northern Chinese cities, defeated the Qing. A pivotal reason why this succeeded, finally overthrew the Qing. One of the main Qing generals switched sides. A guy named Yuan Shikai. In English, spelled Yuanshikii. Interesting character, pivotal figure in early Chinese history, early 20th century Chinese history, but not in a good way. He was a military guy. Yuan Shikai had an army in the north of China, the Baiyang Army, which was an offshoot of the New Army, which was created during the very late reforms of Dowager Empress. I believe it was pretty large, 60 divisions at one point, very large army. I don't know how good they were. Um, odd figure. He actually was one of the figures who crushed the earlier 100 Days reform. At the same time, a little bit later, he was playing his own game. He was kind of loyal to the Qing, but yet pushed fought them in some areas. He kind of carved out some northern China as his own fiefdom during the very late Qing period. Anyway, he made a deal with Sun Yat-sen and his Tongmenghui rebels that he'll join them. He'll join the rebellion against the Qing on the condition that he gets a post in the new government. So he said, okay, and he did. He switched sides basically, and he became president. Sun Yat-sen, and there were negotiations with the Dowager Empress had died by this time. The emperor was a young boy, Henry Puyi in English, and he was basically pensioned off. I think he could keep a title of emperor, but no power. He was basically under house arrest in his palace. And if you see the movie, the Bernardo Bertolucci movie, The Last Emperor, it's about that. The movie is pretty well known in China, actually, but it's not very popular. My Chinese friend said it romanticizes the Qing. They're far more corrupt and far more brutal than the movie appears. It was not really, it said romanticizes things. It was not particularly popular in China. It's just historically distorted, but it was, cinematographic masterpiece. Not my favorite Bertolucci film, but okay. So anyway, okay, they had this system one Shikai. They were waiting to they had like a provisional government in 1912. They set up a provisional government. One Shikai was the provisional president, and a guy named Sung Jia Ren, who was a friend of Sun Yat-sen, an activist in the Tongmenghui, part of this revolutionary movement. He was kind of the premier. I think the system they were thinking of building was like the French system. They were a head of state, then prime minister, a premier, and then a two-house legislature. Okay, so very quickly, Wen Shikai lived from 1859 to 1916. He was president, became president in 1812 or so. He became increasingly autocratic and dictatorial, and people were worried. It was supposed to be a provisional government while they were working on a constitution. So he became increasingly power hungry to push back against this Song Jiaren, who was kind of the number two guy in the movement, the Tongmenghui movement. He organized the Tongmenghui and in parliament, they'd representatives in parliament, in this legislature. He organized them united with some smaller parties, form what's known as the Kuomintang. It's the National People's Party. The K, usually in read about it in English, it's the KMT. Sometimes Americans pronounce it as Kuomintang, but it's pronounced something like Kuomintang. Guo means national, Min means people, and Dong means party. So National People's Party. Okay, so they're a bit of an amorphous ideology, but they wanted to build a republic. They had elections. The elections were very, very limited. Like only 10% of the population of China could vote. The whole system was oriented towards the Kuomintang was initially oriented towards the elite, the landowners, the big merchants, and so on. And they did very well. The Kuomintang did very well in the elections. So when Shikai counterattacked, he banned the Kuomintang. He banned them, purged them from government, arrested them, killed a couple of them. Song Jiaren died under kind of mysterious circumstances. They usually regarded Wen Shikai had him killed. So anyway, he became basically closed parliament and ended parliament, and made himself dictator, and then he made himself emperor. He was emperor. He tried to make himself emperor. This was and start a new dynasty. This was an intensely unpopular idea. It kind of led to the warlord period. It's actually called the father of one Shikai is called the father of the warlords. He tried to make himself emperor. It was opposed by his own generals. It was opposed by wide layers of people in China. That period had ended. The emperor imperial period had ended. We have to build a modern society. It was an intensely unpopular idea. His sons were actually fighting among themselves who's going to be the prince regent, whatever. He never had an official coronation because of this opposition. Um, yeah, even before he declared himself emperor, there was what's called the Second Revolution in China. There's a rebellion, several southern provinces, which Sun Yat-sen was involved in. This failed. This Second Revolution failed, and he increased his power. Wan Shikai was able to dramatically increase his power, his hold over China. The rebellion backfired. Created a militarized system of provincial governors, appointing like military governors in various provinces. This was one of the major things which led to the warlord period in the 1920s, a little bit later. So anyway, he made himself emperor. It was utter disaster, very unpopular. He was shocked. He thought he'd get public support. After he didn't. The only people who supported him, interestingly, were the British. They traditionally support monarchies in Iraq later on, at the same time in Iraq and Middle East. They installed these puppet monarchies. They like monarchies. The British diplomatically supported him and he gave him loans, but no one else did. The Japanese didn't support him. He was hoping for Japanese support. And he was in poor health. He had uremia, and he finally stepped down as emperor. He was still president, but he stepped down as an emperor for 83 days exactly. So he stepped down, and China morphed into a period of chaos. Very complicated. There was an attempt to restart the republic, to create a presidential cabinet system that failed. And there's a short-lived attempt to revive the Qing dynasty that also failed. Then the warlord period, the Baiyang army, which Wan Shikai commanded, kind of broke up into different fiefdoms, and essentially the period for quite a while, the next 10 years really, was potentially warlords around Beijing jockeying for position, like whoever had the most power would be president, the other guy would resign, they go back and forth. Some warlords had some sense of social justice, maybe. Some were extremely vicious, anti-worker strikes were crushed, or striking workers were shot. Peasant rebellions were just dealt with very harshly. Some of the warlords were really extremely brutal and cruel. Almost all of them were complete opportunists. They'd switch sides on a dime. They're interested in their own power. So that is the situation. Okay, so while this was going on, drama with Wan Kai and kind of basically collapse of the central government, this was cut across by because what was going on in the First World War. And China entered the First World War on the side of the Entente, which was originally Britain, France, Russia, later the United States and other countries. That China sent 150,000 laborers who were nominally part of the British military. They worked in France, in Africa, in Mozambique, also in Mesopotamia. And I believe most of them came from the Shanghai area. And this had a huge influence on the later Chinese working class. These laborers learned Western techniques of organizing, union organizing, workers organizing. They made contacts with socialists in these countries. I had a big influence back when they came back home to China. Okay, so during the war, Japan also entered the war on the side of the Entente. And Germany at that time had occupied part of Shandong province, which is a peninsula area somewhat north of Beijing. I mentioned it last time. Confucius was from Shandong, town of Chufu, kind of roughly in the middle. Anyway, there's a city called Qingdao. It's built by the Germans. I've been there. It's looks like a Bavarian village. The Germans built it. They had a coaling station for their ships or whatever. And they occupied large areas of Shandong province. The Japanese, I think it was 1915, had a siege of Qingdao, took Qingdao. Anyway, the up, up the what happened is after World War One, the Entente uh, awarded Qingdao and Shandong to the Japanese instead of giving it back to the Chinese. Woodrow Wilson has self-determination of nations, I think 21 points or something like that. Japan had earlier. Okay, so Japan also entered World War One on the side of the Entente, and they also took the opportunity to impose on China something called the 21 Demands, which would have meant they could occupy Shandong, Inner Mongolia, Manchuria, in other regions of China. Part of it meant they could have the fifth demand was that China would be essentially an economic colony of Japan. This was how horrifically humiliating, of course, to China. It was a public relations disaster to Japan at the time, actually, but the Japanese were only doing what the Westerners had done a couple decades earlier. There was enormous hypocrisy, of course. They were only doing exactly what the British, French, Germans had done a few decades earlier. But it made the Japanese Empire look really bad. Anyway, so 1919. So Woodrow Wilson had his famous self-determination of nations and wanted, the war was supposedly fought for democracy and self-determination against imperialism. Well, that was all nonsense. And uh, Shandong and Qingdao was awarded to the Japanese. And this created outrage in China. There was outrage, huge protests. Well, first there was something called the May 4th movement, which is a big part of early 20th century Chinese history, huge influence. First, there was a protest in Paris, Chinese students in Paris, joined by French students as well. And the Chinese delegation there refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War One. Due to this pressure, and then it hit China itself. There were students in Beijing and elsewhere, then Shanghai. Then it became a mass movement, and the warlords hated this. Of course, they wanted to get along with the Japanese, who were increasingly encroaching in China. They started to crack down, but they couldn't fully crack down because the student movement was intense, was very popular, and had enormous public support. And then it quickly morphed into a working class movement. It hit the workers in Shanghai, which is an industrial center of China then, or the industrial commercial center. There was a general strike in Shanghai and other cities, which general strike and a boycott of Japanese goods, and this for all shut down the Chinese economy. And it was actually supported by the elite, by the bosses, strange as it sounds. It was supported out of a wave of nationalism, and these people, like some of the ruling class of China, hated the Japanese as well. So it had wide public support. The Japanese did back down on Article 5, making Japan an economic colony. So this movement was huge. It also, another aspect, the May 4th movement led to something called the New Culture movement. Um, Basically, there was a huge interest in progressive Western thought of the time. First, interest in Darwin or modern science, or Locke, Berkeley, some of the liberal French Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire, whatever. Then it quickly morphed. John Dewey, the American pragmatist philosopher, progressive educator, was very popular in China. He came to China several times. He was very popular, and then there was one of the key figures in this was a guy named Chen Shui. He lived from 1879 to 1942. Fascinating figure, important, very pivotal figure. So Chen Shui was a revolutionary. He was part of the Xinhai movement, 1911 movement. During the very late Qing, he was a high school teacher apparently, and he organized students, organized militant students into anti-Qing groups. Uh, he became an academic. He was at the University of Nanjing, and he had a journal called New Youth, which it just started before the May 4th movement, but it quickly became a voice for it. Then he got a job at University of Beijing, which then and now is a very prestigious university in China. It was one of the Western universities which were founded during the very reform period, late Qing reform period. Anyway, he was dean of some school there, and he brought New Youth Journal with him. And he also, while Chen Dushui was at Beijing University, he linked up. The head librarian was a guy named Li Daozhong. Chen Dushui came from a wealthy family. Li Daozhong came from a poor peasant family, but he was the head librarian. He ran a Marxist study group, so they linked up, and New Youth had a series of articles, I believe in 1919, series of articles explaining Marxism. And this was regarded as the most thorough explanation of Marxism in China at that time. And it was a bombshell. It was a huge, got a huge amount of attention. It was a bombshell. Chen Shui, the powers that be, or some of the conservative university authorities, or more conservative, weren't too happy about this. He was fired from his post. Then he was apparently distributing literature against the current leaders of China, basically two warlord figures who were close to the Japanese. He called them to resign, any politicians to resign who were too close to the Japanese, called for freedom of speech and things like that. And he was arrested for this for 3 months. He went to Shanghai, and ironically, he was in the French concession of Shanghai. He's more freer to pursue his political activities, and he became a full-scale Marxist at that point. So one of the biggest things that came out of the May 4th movement was the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party was officially founded in 1921. Chen Shui, Li Daizhao, and others from study groups and workers organizing groups. And it was officially founded in 1921 Shanghai. Okay, while that was going on, uh, Sun Yat-sen, after Yuan Shikai died, Sun Yat-sen and his followers went to Guangzhou, Canton, to try to regroup. And Sun Yat-sen originally had hopes in the local warlord in Guangzhou, who was nominally part of the Kuomintang himself. He had a militia, his own army group, and he was hoping to use him to retake China, essentially build an army, go north, and defeat the warlords. But they had kind of a falling out. This warlord character became literally a warlord. Was playing his own game, really. He didn't want to share power, and they had a falling out. So something really saved the Kuomintang. There was a peasant uprising. The Kuomintang organized a military with the support, including the local peasants and workers, and they defeated this warlord. So the Kuomintang, the KMT, could have headquarters in Canton only because of the peasants, a peasant uprising, peasant and workers uprising in support of them. And this bit of a delayed reaction, but after 1911, China was gradually or more rapidly morphing into a broad social revolution, peasant uprising and workers uprising. So the Communist Party the headquarters relocated to Guangzhou, and they worked closely with the Kuomintang. This is a whole interesting story. Okay, so early Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution, 1917, of course, had a huge influence on all this, and of course, all this, and it was an inspiration for forming a Communist Party. Was an inspiration. I did not mention this, but it's very important. So they wanted to make contact. They sent advisors. They didn't have much knowledge of what was happening originally in China. There's something called the Comintern, the Communist International, the Fourth International was founded. Revolutions had failed in the West, but they were somewhat hopeful maybe something in the East would develop, India or China. They had something called the Irkutsk Bureau, which was the uh, Eastern observation group of the Comintern. They had some liaison with China, but the Comintern early on sent people to Guangzhou to work with the Kuomintang. Since one guy named Maring, Maring. He was a Dutch socialist. His name was something like Hendrik Snivliet. Fascinating character. He was a Dutch socialist before World War One. He was a city council member at one point. He became disgusted at what he thought was the opportunism of the Dutch socialist movement. Like at one point there was a strike, and the Socialist Party he was in refused to cooperate. Refused to cooperate with it. He joined a more radical socialist group, but overall he felt the Dutch socialist movement was compromised and totally reformist. So he went to Indonesia. Indonesia at that time was a Dutch colony. There were horrific, brutal rubber plantations. Same time, there were a lot of working class Dutch people who settled there, including the Dutch army had actually a working class orientation. So he went to Indonesia to organize, and he worked with a group called Sarakat Islam, which was kind of an Islamic nationalist movement which had arisen. And he came and he also organized one union, which was the only union where Dutch people and local Indonesian people could be in the same union. He apparently was a very good organizer. And out of the Sarakat Islam, oddly, he organized what became the Dutch Socialist Party and later the Dutch Communist Party. Kind of odd in some ways. So it worked for him. So he went. So anyway, after World War One, the commentator felt he had some experience in China, in Asia. He some experience in Asia, so they sent him to China to work with the early Chinese Communist Party, and he pushed very hard to cooperate with the Kuomintang. Kuomintang at this point, led by Sun Yat-sen, was kind of a diffuse organization. They'd largely been defeated by the warlords. They were attempting a comeback. They were a very mixed organization. Uh, they also Soviets. The Comintern also sent a guy named Voitinsky, Grigory Voitinsky, who helped organize the Marxism of the early Communist Party and kind of whip them into shape as a Communist Party. He played a role. Okay, so Maring really wanted to repeat what he did in Indonesia. He said we have to work with these Kuomintang reformists, largely reformists, but we can bring people out of this and build a movement from this group. It was mistaken in this case, totally mistaken. Also, there was a strike in 1920, a Siemens strike in Hong Kong and Guangzhou. They're nearby. They're almost not quite the same city, but they're very close to each other. Guangzhou and Hong Kong. So there was a huge Siemens strike, lasted 8 weeks. It was an epic strike. The British were firing on people, shooting workers at one point, but they actually succeeded. It was a bitter strike, but they did succeed in getting a pay raise. I believe it was mostly a strike against British shipping lines. They actually succeeded. And most of the organizers were Kuomintang organizers. They did have labor organizers. The Kuomintang was mixed. They had people from different backgrounds, but they did have some leftist labor organizers. So the lesson that the young Chinese Communist Party got from that is we're not ready to go on our own. We have to work closely with the Kuomintang. That's the only game in town at this point. Okay, so Sun Yat-sen welcomed the alliance with the communists. Um, he thought it could help him. His hope for alliance with this warlord didn't work out too well, so he wasn't really interested in communism per se, but he was interested in modeling the Kuomintang, the KMT, after the communist movement. He was really impressed by this. And so he accepted this alliance. Soviets put Mikhail Borodin, an advisor, and he brought a lot of military training. In fact, they started something called the Whampoa Military Academy. At one point, Zhou Enlai was the number two guy of this to train a Kuomintang army. There were some danger signals there. Most of these officers came from landlord backgrounds and they were not too happy about these peasant uprising. But so the Kuomintang was socially very, very mixed. The top leadership did seem like it was connected with the landlords and the Shanghai bankers. So just the same, the Comintern and the first under Zinoviev, and then under later leaders insisted on closely working with the Kuomintang. They formed a military academy. The Kuomintang itself was organized along what's called Leninist lines. Uh, the Leninism in this case just meant a disciplined party, like Steve Bannon, Trump's right-wing advisor. He talked about being a Leninist. He wasn't so like he was definitely not so Marxist, but he felt like a disciplined party organization. So oddly, the Kuomintang was like an anti-communist Leninist party essentially. So they borrowed some of these techniques, and so there was some pushback about being so embedded in the Kuomintang. Shindu Shui said, well, maybe, there's a Marxist principle of class independence, so maybe it's not really a good idea. Maybe we should, we can get along with them and work with them, but we should, not organize so tightly with them. Said, nope, this idea was shouted down. They very much insisted we work with the Comintern kept insisting we work with the Kuomintang. We work closely with them. So another figure comes into play, Shang Kai-Shek. In Chinese, his name is pronounced something like Shang Kai-Shek. He came from, I believe, a northern merchant family, lived from 1887 to 1975. He was a fascinating figure. First, he was a military guy. He studied under the late Qing. He studied, went to a military academy in Japan. He was going to be a Qing officer, I guess, in the modern army. He came back to China. Um, he worked with this was early stage of the Shanghai Revolution. He went to Shanghai and he worked with organized crime with the Green Gang. And he most likely was a hitman for them. There's a story. He killed the opponent of one of the top leaders of the Green Gang. No one quite knows what happened, but he fell on hard times. At one point, he was probably broken, harmless, and homeless. He went to Guangzhou and offered his services to the Kuomintang. And he very quickly rose through the ranks, became on the general staff, and became a chief of staff of the Kuomintang Army. Very quickly, he talked his way up into a job. Okay, so Sun Yat-sen himself died in 1925, and Chiang Kai-shek married Sun Yat-sen's daughter. So he kind of was the he was a military chief of staff by this time, and he was more or less top guy after Sun Yat-sen died. And so okay, he got along. Oh, yeah, before he became chief of staff, he actually studied in the Soviet Union for I think 3 months. He got some military training there. He was an unremarkable student. Nobody said much about him. He apparently didn't make much of an impression on anybody. But then he came back and he was in the chief. He worked his way up to be a chief of staff. Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang staff. Married Sun Yat-sen's daughter, and then Sun Yat-sen died in 1925. Okay, so that's the situation. You have a large communist group, and you have the Kuomintang kind of sharing power in Guangzhou. They were only able to establish like a military government there because of a peasant uprising against the warlord, peasant and workers uprising. The communist movement was increasingly embedded within the Kuomintang. In fact, at one point they even did not organize as communists. They organized a Kuomintang branch as Kuomintang, as the KMT. It was they think, no, we have to be totally embedded in the Kuomintang. So Chiang Kai-shek married Sun Yat-sen's daughter. He became chief of the general staff of the Kuomintang. He was chief of the Whampoa Military Academy. Interestingly, for a time, Zhou Enlai, who was later number 2 guy under Mao, leader of China, was the assistant director of the Whampoa Military Academy. Anyway, he assumed basically leadership. Sun Yat-sen died in 1925. Okay, so there's an uneasy tension there. There was some gradually increasing tension between the left and the right. There were some left Kuomintang labor organizers, labor leaders, and people more on the left and allied with the communists. And there's kind of a right Kuomintang, right faction, which Chiang Kai-shek was on the right. It appeared. These people came from landlord families and were not too happy with peasant uprisings, peasant or workers uprisings. They did want to unite China. But these two groups had an uneasy alliance, and initially looked like the left was riding high. The Communist Party had the support of the Soviet Union, who were giving them military aid and advice, and looked like they were riding high. And Chiang Kai-shek, for a while, 1925 and 1926, told them, we want good relations with all factions. We want to get along. We want to unite China. He gave a speech between a group called the Militant Youth. I think what was a Kuomintang group, said, no, we have to, the Kuomintang is an important part of the global social revolution, on like that. And actually, the Kuomintang was actually recognized as like a sympathizing a member of the Comintern, of the Communist International. They weren't like a voting member, but they were like a sympathizer, like a delegate to the Comintern for a time. So anyway, in 1926, unexpectedly, uh, Chiang Kai-shek pulled a coup. He purged the communists from the Kuomintang military government in Guangzhou. They're all fired, all gotten rid of, pushed out. Some have beaten in prison. I don't know if he killed a lot of them, but it was a coup. He definitely took power, and these peasant associations were crushed. Now the communists and the left was completely unprepared for this. They didn't expect it. Anyway, all along he was planning. It's called the Great Northern Expedition. Sun Yat-sen had hoped to do this. He died before it could happen, but Chiang Kai-shek and the whole Kuomintang movement was planning a move north to retake China from the warlords. Finally, so he unified the country. And before he did that, he cracked down on the communists, purged them. And he began moving north. The Kuomintang army said most of the officers came from landlord families to begin with. And as they moved north, the peasants and workers saw this as part of a social trigger for a social revolution. There were strikes, there were peasant uprisings everywhere all along the route right before it. And this got a little weird. So finally, in Wuhan, there was not weird. I'll explain. Wuhan, the city called Wuhan, which is in the news recently. It's kind of north central China, kind of a sort of it's a manufacturing hub. Today it's called China's furnace, both because it's the center of China's steel industry and it's very hot. Anyway, Wuhan, there was a workers and peasant uprising, which basically took the city from the warlords, and they welcomed the Kuomintang. Wuhan became center. There was something of a split in the Kuomintang. There was something of a split in the Kuomintang movement. The left formed a group, a rival, a rival government, the left Kuomintang. There's some figures allied with the communists. There's some figures uh, originally led by a guy named Eugene Chen, who is an interesting character. He was Chinese. He was from Trinidad. He actually didn't speak Chinese. He needed an interpreter, but he was their top leader originally. Then he was replaced by a guy named Wei Jingwei, who was really famous. Later on, became famous for working with the Japanese. He's regarded as a traitor, but he was part of the longtime left Kuomintang movement. The famous Sung sisters played a role in this, kind of fascinating. Just as an aside, there were three sisters and one brother, the Sung family. They were early Christian converts. They were sort of part of this elite, westernized elite in China that was developing. They made money off of selling. Originally, the family became very wealthy off of selling Bibles and religious literature. Anyway, there were three daughters. There's Song Qingling, Song Meiling, and Song Eiling. All went to Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, sponsored by Methodist missionaries, I guess. And apparently they spoke English with a Southern accent, with a Georgian accent. Anyway, so Song Qingling married Sun Yat-sen. Song Meiling married Shang Kai-Shek. She actually, she was like became Madam Shang Kai-Shek. She lived to 103, actually. Really interesting. She died in the late 1970s, I think. And Sung Eiling married a banker, became famous in banking circles. So there was a brother, TV Sung, who was a banker. Anyway, Sung Qingling was one of the top leaders of this left Kuomintang group. By the way, Sterling Seagrave wrote a book years ago, journalist on the Sungs. It's really a great read, fascinating read. Anyway, Sung Qingling was on the left, moved to the left. She, as far as I know, she never joined the Communist Party, but she was sympathetic towards it. She was one of the leaders of the left Wuhan group. The communists were driven out of Chiang Kai-shek's group and gravitated towards the left Kuomintang, and they organized. They actually organized again only as the Kuomintang. In fact, there's a rule they couldn't have organizing. They couldn't use a communist flag. They could only use the Kuomintang flag, even after part of the Kuomintang had turned on them. So they had hopes in this left Kuomintang group. Leaders of the Soviet Union this time were Stalin and Bukharin. Stalin was becoming increasingly more powerful. Part of the motivation for this class collaborationist policy of working with the Kuomintang, first originally it was Maring's ideas with Maring's viewpoints with the Sarakat Islam group. Interestingly, he was a fascinating figure. Maring, Hendrik Sneevliet, he went back to the Netherlands. He kind of became disillusioned with Stalinism, and he was a Trotskyist, became a Trotskyist for a time. I became disillusioned with that. He was in some ultra-left communist group. He was part of the underground resistance when in the Second World War, some socialist group organizing against the Nazis. He was shot, I think, in 1943 by the Nazis. Him and his comrades were singing the International when they were shot. The guy has a fascinating life, sad life, but really fascinating figure. I may do a video about him. I don't know. So anyway, it was motivated by his experiences, and then the early Soviet Union was in a very fragile situation. They'd just gone through a devastating civil war, and various writers make the case that uh, the attitude of the Soviet leaders was conditioned by the Civil War. They were siege mentality. They were paranoid. At all costs, we have to preserve the stability of the Soviet Union. That was this idea. And then it came to preserving the bureaucracy. Not so much the Soviet Union as socialism, but the needs of the bureaucracy. And they above all wanted stability in China and any place else. They didn't think China was ready for a social revolution. This idea I'll just mention is completely different from the Mensheviks idea. Sorry, from completely different from the Bolsheviks' original idea, and they run up to the Soviet to the Russian Revolution in 1917. Of course, the Mensheviks thought that Russia's not ready for a socialist revolution. We need to fully develop capitalism. Marx had a famous quote that no society goes on to the next stage until it's fulfilled the historic roles of this stage. So they took that very literally. Thought that so all socialists could do is tail liberal parties were not quite ready for socialism. Then was more fully developed, like a two-stage theory. The Bolsheviks cut across that, especially Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. It's the bourgeois class has no longer able to fulfill its historic roles and ultimately be a barrier. It's up to the working class from below to push through that. So in China, though, they did the exact opposite tactic. Lenin died in 1923, I believe, and he was kind of out of it. He had a series of strokes. And the leadership after him was increasingly Soviet leadership, especially the Comintern was increasingly weaker. They gave a series of monumentally bad advice, and China was one of the biggest disasters. I'll get to the disaster. So they kept insisting that, the communists work with the Kuomintang even after Chiang Kai-shek's coup had crushed them. Okay, so they were working with the left Kuomintang, and then 1927, Chiang Kai-shek began moving his army, Kuomintang army, north, subduing the warlords, and there's a wave of peasant uprisings in its wake, until they got to Shanghai, and they stopped at the outskirts of Shanghai. And there was a workers' uprising. Workers were rapturously greeting the Kuomintang, they'd signed welcome liberators. But the Kuomintang stopped outside Shanghai, and they allowed to organize the Green Gang, which Chiang Kai-shek had ties with earlier, to massacre the workers. We don't know how many people, thousands, maybe upwards of 10,000 people were killed. There are people were beheaded in the streets. It was a horrific slaughter, an enormous, horrific slaughter, and similar slaughters occurred elsewhere. It was a huge setback. Didn't destroy the communist movement, but it was a setback. And first, okay, it was a shock, but Stalin time reiterated, no, we still can't break with the Kuomintang even after this. We have to organize with the Kuomintang. We oppose Chiang Kai-shek, but we organize with the Kuomintang. By the way, some of this news was not, the Comintern didn't allow it to leak out, like when Sun Yat-sen pulled his coup, in I think 1926 in Guangzhou. They said, the commentators said, it's just Western propaganda. Don't believe any of it. And they were very reluctant to believe any stories about what was actually happening in China. What this class collaborationist policy was leading to. Okay, so there's a horrific massacre in Shanghai. The Green Gang and then the Kuomintang occupied kept moving north. Then it wasn't a working class movement anymore. They pushed. So this left Kuomintang group, they got a lord called Feng Yu-shuang. He was a northern warlord. He was nicknamed the Christian warlord. He supposedly had something of a social conscience and something supposedly reformer. Later on said he was sympathetic to communism and the Soviet Union. Anyway, he ditched that, but he became close for a while to the Wuhan, the left Wuhan group, the left Kuomintang group. They kind of complicated. They invited him in. They invited an alliance with him, and then they became a little scared of him. So one of his conditions for an alliance, Fang Yushuang's conditions was you have to get rid of the communists, purge, crack down on the communists, like Sun Yat-sen did earlier, and they did. They crushed the communists. The peasant groups were crushed, were just destroyed, and the communists had to flee for their lives. They were still very reluctant to break. So still, even the worst of the orders were don't break from the Kuomintang. This is only temporary. Don't break. But they eliminated the communists as well. And then the left Kuomintang finally collapsed. Anyway, they rejoined. Shang Kai-Shek in Nanjing, which became the nationalist capital. And he finally subdued most of the warlords. The warlord period really didn't end until 1949. They weren't finally crushed until then. So it was a huge disaster for the Communist Party. Then, to add insult to injury, they tried the other extreme, ultra-left attack. Uh, in Guangzhou or Canton, after Chiang Kai-shek left his army, the local Kuomintang leadership really cracked down on them, destroyed the peasant society, peasant organizations, workers' organizations, really viciously cracked down on them. It was a really tough time. But the idea was the communists said, okay, we're going to have an uprising. We're going to, this is the ultra left, the other extreme. Let's have an uprising. Let's rebel again. And they finally did. When it was too late, and the forces were depleted, they had really little chance of success. They led or called for a workers' and peasant rebellion against the Kuomintang, and it was predictably a complete disaster. The Kuomintang was scattered, the communists were scattered, and they were kind of essentially eliminated as a working class movement. And it would be a long time, if ever, before they were revived as a working class movement. One small area of success, Mao Zedong was one of the founding members of the Communist Party. He wasn't the top leader, but he's one of the founding members. He was a librarian, worked with Li Dezhao, one of the founders, the two main founders of the Communist Party. He worked at the library. He was a librarian at the University of Beijing, and he was from Hunan province. He led an uprising in Hunan Jiangxi province. Against the Kuomintang and had some succeed for a couple of weeks. It was eventually crushed. It's called the Autumn Harvest Uprising. It succeeded, eventually crushed, but this showed possibility of a different direction, of like rural, use the peasantry. A working class revolution had failed, but this showed possibility of a different direction. Things could go in, and I'll talk about this in my next video. Some of the figures, by the way, Chen Shui, he was originally general secretary of the Communist Party. He was pushed out, I believe, in 1927. He originally opposed the Comintern class collaborationist policy. Then he kind of came around, said, yeah, then he was associated with enforcing it, with pushing it. Originally didn't like it, but yeah, okay, he pushed for it. This later made him unpopular, but he was pushed out as general secretary in 1927. He became interested. He became a Trotskyist, interested in Trotskyism. He corresponded with Trotsky, and after he was kicked out of the Communist Party, I think in 1928, he went back to teaching high school, I think in Nanjing, if I remember. And he organized loosely some Trotskyist groups in China. Trotsky liked him. He was actually unpopular with younger Chinese Trotskyists because he was largely blamed for this policy. Trotsky liked him and tried to reassure his younger comrades, he's cool, we have to work with him. Anyway, he apparently tried to meet with Mao. He had been friends with Mao earlier. They had largely broken. Mao said, yeah, you can rejoin the Communist Party if you renounce Trotskyism. Said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I believe in 1942 or 43, he apparently was on a trip to meet Mao, and he mysteriously vanished. We don't know what happened to him. Might have been killed by the Kuomintang, by the warlords, maybe by Mao, but there's some different stories about what happened. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this video. Next one hopefully will be out next week on from 1927 to 1949, how Mao and the communists came to power. And that's it. Thank you.